Hi guys, Mrs. Novello here in the Expressive Arts Room, and today we're going to talk about wacky watercolor techniques. So watercolor is a basic technique. We all have access to watercolors, and they're pretty simple and easy to use. But for your project, we're going to kick it up a notch by using some techniques that will just make subtle changes to the watercolor effect, and it'll be fun creating them. So the techniques we're using today are salt, saran wrap, rubbing alcohol, and rice. And you can see I kind of have a rough idea, a visual for you to see how those practices are going to be laid out for you today. So let's get started. So you'll all get a template that looks like this, and you'll all have watercolors and water, and you'll have your little samplings of your ingredients: salt, rubbing alcohol, rice, and some saran wrap. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to be coloring the entire square, and I'm going to go over some brief directions before we get started. So before you begin, make sure that you wet wash your section first. Wet washing is simply just applying water to the brush, dipping your brush into water, and getting your paper wet. You'll be painting the entire section of each technique, but for the sake of practice, I'm just going to do a small section. So I'm going to start with saran wrap, and I have that wet. And I also want to make sure that I drop in water into my paint palette, which I've done that already. And so for this, I'm going to use blue. The thing about these techniques is you have to load your paper with color. So even if you have applied a layer of color and you feel it looks dark, you're going to need to dip your brush in water and add another layer so that it's really, really layered thick with watercolor. And then this process happens fast. You're going to crumple up or arrange your saran wrap however you want, and you're going to push down and blot. And when I do that, you can kind of see there may be a glare, that there's some texture created by the saran wrap. And how you crumple up the saran wrap will determine the amount of texture you get. So this is a subtle method for making your watercolor a little bit texturized with a saran wrap. So that is technique one. And again, you'll be completing your entire square to really get a good idea for what this technique looks like in a large scale. Moving on, now some of these techniques are going to give you the effects in the next 24 hours. You kind of have to trust in the method, and tomorrow when you come back to class, or the next day when you come back to class, you will be able to move the product like rice to reveal the texture that it looks like. So again, you're going to wet wash this area, the whole area, but for time I'm just doing a small section. Layering that color nice and dark, and even if you think you've got a nice layer, I want you to layer it again by dipping your brush in water and applying another layer. And then within that section, you're simply going to color or cover the watercolor with rice. Just a layer. And this sits on your watercolor overnight. And then when it dries, you'll brush off the rice and see the texture that is revealed beneath. All right, so for your next technique, using a different color, again, starting with a wet wash. I'm doing a small section, you'll do a large. And loading your brush up with the color that you want. I'm going to use red. You can choose whatever color you want. And making sure that I really, really get a lot of color. All right, so once that's done, I'm going to do one more layer. I like a really bold red. All right, let's see if that works. Yeah, I like that better. Okay, so for this one, now what you're going to do is use the tip of your brush. You may use Q-tips or a clean brush itself, but you're simply going to dip your brush into the rubbing alcohol and kind of tap it to let little sprinkles fall. You want little sprinkles, not big drops, because the little sprinkles will make smaller areas of color that is being removed, and it looks like little droplings, and you can kind of see what that looks like. There may be a glare, but it's really cool, kind of like a lava lamp. All right, so that is rubbing alcohol. And then the last technique is using salt. And we're going to use iodized regular kitchen salt, which is really fine grain. I'm going to wet wash your area and then load that area with color. Do a second, even a third layer if you feel like your color needs to be a little bit more bold. It's not necessarily the color alone, it's the color and paint water concentration, especially when you're placing something on top of it. It needs to have enough color and water to indent. Alright, so here's the salt sprinkle. This and the rice, they need to sit overnight. You can already see how the salt is absorbing the color, giving it more of a darker monochromatic effect. And let's see if my sample that I made earlier, let's see if we can brush that off and see what those textures look like. Alright, so getting back to this example that I showed you earlier, you can see the salt is absorbing here, but let's move that rice off and see if we have any effect from that. It may be too soon. Yeah, a little too soon for that. Oh, no, I see some texture, and I see some deposits of color that have moved around that rice. But this definitely needs to be dried overnight for you to see the full effects. So what you're going to do is complete your sample. You should be coloring your sections completely like I've done, choosing different colors, loading with color, and practice those techniques and set it on the rack to dry.